item to read before business meeting on Saturday for COV&R members. Also, just a little warning from the Colegio, please be careful with the trash. So there are cans around on the patios and in the bathrooms. So please be careful because we have a little warning. And without no further delay, I will have to introduce you our speaker from right now, who is Professor David Freedberg. Professor David Freedberg is a Pierre Matisse Professor of History of Art and Director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America at Columbia University. He was also Director of the Rivalry Institute at the University of London from July 2015 to April 2017. Professor Freedberg is best known for his work on the subject of subjective responses to art, and particularly for his studies on iconoclasm and censorship. Taking up the main pieces of his grand oeuvre, The Power of Images, Studies in the History and Theory of Response, he has recently been engaged in research and experiments on the relations between vision, embodiment, movement, and emotion. This has led him to delve, alongside Vittorio Valese, into the realm of neuroscience, particularly in regard to the role mirror neurons play in aesthetic experience. It's an honor to have you here. Professor Freedberg, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me all? Is it too loud? Soft? Is this right? Okay. I'm very honored to be here. I was going to say that later, but I'm very moved. And I hope that you will tolerate my errors and not throw me out before the end of the session. So I was brought up in South Africa speaking both English and Afrikaans. From the age of 6, I studied the Hebrew Bible and its Aramaic interpreters in the Talmud of Midrash with a violent local rabbi who nevertheless instilled the love of biblical literature in me, but made me very antipathetic to any form of organized religion. At university, I studied Greek and Latin literatures before finally getting around to the history of art and images. I like to think that it's the kind of background which prepared me for the work of René Girard, and perhaps allows me to expand it, since he seems to have written so little directly about the anthropology of responses to visual images. So now that I've got that little piece of mimetic rivalry out of the way, let's get on with it. Since those early days, I've spent much of my life writing about violence and sacred, and I'm ashamed to say that I don't think the name of René Girard bears there even once. I should be ashamed of myself and not be here at all. Perhaps I could seek penance for that failure today and begin to remedy this lack. So please, as I said before, don't hesitate to make any corrections you wish to any of my all too superficial readings' work. I think that when I first looked at Girard, I was both intimidated and put off. I was intimidated by the power and ambition of his I found his combination of philosophy, anthropology, psychology, a little bit too difficult, too apodictic, and too distant from the empirical approach I desired for my own researches about violence and religion. I was not altogether convinced by his unrelenting psychology of violence, sacrifice, and scapegoat. Only later did I realize that we shared a strong agreement to the line of now dated members of the British Anthropological School that began with the great Rivers and Hatton, to whom I think Girard did not give enough credit, and which reached its apogee in the work of Evans, Richard Batch, Brown, Leonard, and Victor Turner, to whom he did, was abundantly credit. Indeed, I've always thought of myself not just as a historian of images, but as a philosophically inclined anthropologist. But now to the topic of our conference, Desire Among the Ruins, Mimesis and the Crisis Representation. It's a wonderful title. It takes us straight to the core of the matters I want to discuss today, and I'm really honored to have been invited to participate in the discussion that he initiated. I'm really grateful also to Anya Kekki and her great team who have been infinitely patient with the person trying to be impatient, for the extraordinary energy and devotion that she and her colleagues have put into bringing this event about, and for framing it in so stimulating and fruitful way. Tanya actually sent me a marvelous paper, which some of you may have heard, but I gather is not to be published. I'm just making a public exhortation that she gets published, the paper entitled Violent Lessons, the Phenomenological Inquiry into an Old Mimetic Endeavor. In this, she compares the approaches to Emmanuel Levinas and René Girard to the question of art itself and the consequences both for phenomenological and Kantian approaches to aesthetics. This is one of the deep problems that I have in my own work. I'm a phenomenologist by inclination and a Kantian because it seems rigorous enough to go on with. Her work takes us straight to the heart, takes us straight to the heart of questions of the visual arts now, a topic to which I think Pierre did not pay nearly as much attention as many of us would have liked, if only. What I want to do now is to set out a view of imitation and mimesis, question one of Pierre's central concepts, that of mimetic rivalry. I also want to turn down the melodrama of so many of our Girardian expressions regarding not just rivalry itself, but also violence, sacrifice, scapegoating, mimetic desire, and so on. It's all pretty strong stuff. Agreed. This may be a futile task, given what you probably will feel to be the inevitably dramatic and violent modifiers of such categories of behavior. Indeed, one might well ask how one could possibly be in this place, Mexico City, amongst the great ruins surrounding us, without discussing the centrality of sacrifice, scapegoating, and violence in both its quotidian and spiritual context. Already begun doing this and coming. What I'd like to do, however, is not so much to set out the elements of my disagreements with Girard's rich and profound work, but rather to draw less pessimistic, indeed less violent conclusions than so much of his work suggests, and touch on those areas where, however unfashionably, our thinking converges. It converges, let me say in advance, in our agreement about the ecumenical implications of his researches and our reservations about fashionable positions regarding difference. I wait, if you will allow me a first moment of melodrama, your fire. In today's talk, I'll deal with two central topics of his and one of my own that directly impacts and reinforces his conclusions. In each case, I will adopt a slightly different way of thinking about one, imitation, two, substitution, and three, understanding the feelings, both physical and psychological, of others, and not only those from culture. I think many of you may know, some of you, that I've been involved in the analysis of the motives and mechanisms of image destruction almost all my academic life, by which I mean the willful production of the actual ruins of representation. Today's not the day to talk about ruins by nature, talk about ruins by human beings, made willfully by them. There aren't many who have studied in such close detail how the violence that follows upon mimetic desire, that I've certainly done, plays out in the field of visual representation. My work has been based on the ever-growing material we have on what was actually destroyed and on the alleged and real motives behind iconoclasm's past and present. So, get to the obvious name, Walter Benjamin source saw the more apocalyptic forms of destruction in terms of the victors who carry the spoils, cultural treasures in procession, and who must trample over all those distributed are making. Where we perceive a chain of events, the Antiquus Novus, the new angel by Clay, that is now hung over Benjamin's desk, he saw one single catastrophe. I'm going to show you. So here was the temple in Almira, destroyed in early 20th. And then, much earlier, of course, this, of course, is the explosion of the Buddha's Lamia. Just giving you examples. It keeps, and I'm going on with my quote from Benjamin, it keeps piling ruin upon ruin and hurls it in front of his feet. Yes. the gates of Nineveh. Obviously the armies of ISIS. Hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to say, continues Benjamin, awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. Oops. This storm is what we call progress, says Benjamin. Spoils carried away by the victors. Well, that's all clear enough. The victors win all, and we cannot see what's coming next, because we are left with a melancholy task of simply surveying the ruins, watching the destruction of our heroes, and of the testimony not just of the past, but of what we believe in. But I see these catastrophes and the role of Mimesis in different terms from both Benjamin and Pierre, even though our central ideas, despite all other differences, ultimately converge. Before going into Mimesis' imitation, let me anticipate a little and say a few simple words about scapegoat substitution, precisely because they have such profound consequences, not just for others, but for the representations of others, and therefore, of course, for imitation. Well, for a start, it's clear that the violence entrained by iconoclasm is visited not only on art and architecture, and indeed lowlier objects of every kind, figurative or not, but on people too, sometimes. Here, in front of the great arena in Barbarian Gate, you have these poor captives now beheaded before the gate. And then here are the people who are hung in the wake of the great iconoclasm of 1566 in the North Netherlands, in the south, outside Antwerp, as a kind of concomitant to the images which are just smashed. And here in the contemporary engraving, taking down images of Antwerp Cathedral, December 1566, you can't see it here, but the priests were slaughtered wherever they were found. So these events involving images and architecture may include their very guardians and protectors, from museum curators. Just show you a very sad picture of Khalil al-Assad, who was the curator of the museum, inspectors monuments in Mosul, who was beheaded by ISIS shortly after the destruction of the museum. Briefly, the guardians such as Khalil al-Assad and other devotees, priests, practitioners of the rituals, sent. Here, of course, pronounce the right of Mosul of the upcoming destruction. There. Thus far, the Girardian terms work for such gods. It could not be clearer from these visions. More often than not, iconoclasm is accompanied by the murder of those people who are scapegoated for Christ, not just symbolized but actually embodied by images, which themselves are attacked when the living are not available for sacrifice or assault. And I have long felt some images of destruction in the come back. So here I may anticipate myself, but here the removal of images of people who are no longer available for actual execution. Of course, we would statue planning. Here. There's then all 89. Here, General B being taken down to Baltimore. There, Saddam Hussein coming in Baghdad in 2000. free. They've long felt that the only way to understand these substitutions via the neural processes of embodiment, to think was seeing a living person coming down, want the living person there to bring down, about which we now know a great deal, just as we do about brain reactions, sight, bodies. The substitutional status of the scapegoat victim could not be clearer, but it becomes even more so when we consider the fate of the images themselves. At that point, images become the most useful scapegoat of all. My scapegoat is no longer a person or even an animal, but an object, preferably an object with a subject. I then blame images in art and destroy them and make them my sacrificial victims, or a piss on them. This is someone back there saying the head of the first attack of Saddam Hussein. I'm back to this. And there are further reasons for this too, as we shall see. For one of the things we habitually do across all cultures is to animate the inanimate, both in representation and in meta-representation. As I said, in other words, not only when you represent them, but when you talk about representation, that would bring us on to the question of censorship, which I'm not going to talk about today. As I said, one of my aims now is to consider some less melodramatic ways of putting things about mimetic design, mimetic rivalry, and their consequences. After all, imitation has another dimension which I want to point out to you, which I think you may find rather boring and trivial. I mean, you know about it, but it's not considered by COV&R as far as I know. And it's another dimension well known to historians and psychologists of visual representation, which I feel has been significantly neglected in much of this Girardian discussion, in a way that may seem to run against the grain, but in the end does not. Two things from an aesthetic point of view. Firstly, once one links visual representations to the question of mimesis, it's obvious that mimetic rivalry inevitably comes into play, in a different sense altogether than the way we've been discussing. One artist always strives to do better than another, obviously. Many do indeed do better than one than the other, and over this we can certainly fight. You know, how you assess whether an artist is better than another, that's another problem, maybe for Tanya, maybe for others. But in the second place, there's something else. There's the convincing argument that every effort at imitation, especially in the representational arts, involves correction. You represent something on the basis of how you've seen it in the past, and then you correct it according to how you see it now. This is what the great art historian and visual psychologist Ernst Gombrich called making a matching. In other words, you put out immediately how you think the thing is looked. This is determined by the way it's been done in the past, and then you make your corrections on the paper. You can often see it very clearly. No slides for the moment, there's tons of others. In this sense, representation is always in crisis. The Gombrichian conclusion that making always comes before matching is almost inescapable, and in this respect, every correction we make in the course of producing an image is the result of a crisis of representation. The theory of one kind or another. The theory seems right, and it concords with much visual evidence, but even so, I think we can say that we all have a much larger view of mimesis than just that. At this point, some of you may feel rightly, the discomfort of correction, even that discomfort of correction, even to call it a crisis, may seem too small an aspect of imitation beside the larger anthropological and psychological and certainly more dramatic political issues raised by Girard. Well, yes, indeed. But let's return to the man battering a statue to bits at the gates of Nineveh. How did that get there? There we go. Here's that picture which you saw before. One of the striking things about the ISIS campaigns against images was how much material we had about the actual actions of iconoclasty, the literal actions, I mean. Who does not have a sense, even if only an inward one, of somehow engaging in a similar action to this man, as to other actors here, such as those in Mosul and earlier in Iraq, for example? Now, despite your skepticism, I'm going to ask you to consider the possibility that you immediately have in your own bodies a sense of this movement. Feel the curvature in your back, You can feel the stiffening of the biceps. You can feel the inclination somehow or another in your upper leg muscle. So let's have a look at some more, which I think exemplify the point which I'm making perhaps even more clearly. Here, outside the temple, outside the Museum of Mosul, here is a member of the ISIS team knocking down an ancient Assyrian head. Notice this gesture which we find over and over again as the man holds up the hammer. You have a sense of this in your own arms and body. You have a sense of the landing of the hammer on the head and the front part of that monument about to fall, that sculpted head about to fall. See that hammer. Again, one understands exactly what this guy is doing. One understands it physically and economically and anatomically. And here I want to move on to the destruction of the statue of Saddam in 2003, Hussein in Baghdad. Here's a man hammering at the plinth so that the statue above it will fall. We'll see it later on. Look at those rippling biceps there, and you have a sense also of the force with which he's trying to remove the relief, this low relief sculpture on the bottom, and the inscription on beneath it. But when we look at this, it's quite interesting. Look at the man in the print on the left, which dates from the late 1560s, in a print made to allude to the iconoclastic aspect and episodes of the time, Protestant iconoclasm against the images of the Christian church, of the Catholic church, was paralleled with the destruction of images in the temple of Nebuchadnezzar at the time. And look at the man swinging his arm back. Again, there's no mistaking the bodily impact that these indications of movement hold. And seeing that I've got this on the screen, look at the putter pissing into the head of a statue of Hercules down below. One of the things which I'm not going to talk about today, but look, isn't it interesting? There it is. You can see the man in the background, have a sense of the movement in the body. There's the Cupid, the boy, pissing into the head of Hercules at the bottom. And look how similar that boy is to that man. One of the things that's really interesting when we look at images like these is the limited repertoire of what people can actually do, both with their muscles and in their emotional motivations, and the expression of their emotional motivations by a relatively limited repertoire of action. We know that these are disdainful actions across the centuries, whether it's done in Baghdad in 2003 or in Antwerp in 1566, or for that matter, in some mythical Greco-Roman past, because obviously it's meant to be set in a classical temple. One of the striking things about the ISIS one of the striking things about the ISIS campaigns against images was how much material we had about the actual actions of the iconoclasts, the literal actions, and I think I just said that. But look at this next image I have. Okay, we've lost the image, but that doesn't matter. It wasn't back here. Okay, so we've been talking about images, about, our responses to the movements of extravagant gestures like this. And one day I went to a neuroscientific friend of mine, a neuroscientist friend of mine, actually a neurologist, and I explained to him, how can we do something about the understanding of why we've had this vague feeling in our bodies? It's not enough. I mean, Girard might have written something about the feelings we have in front of being a bit unfair when we're looking at things, but we want empirical evidence of this. I wanted empirical evidence, and I said, well, can we, I made various suggestions, and I said, no, well, you can't talk about it. We can't examine how the whole bodily movement works, but we can do individual gestures. And he said to me, why don't we test this stop gesture with a hand? you raise the hand. Everybody understands this. So because I was interested in the artistic representation, because that's art, not only art, but I thought we can try, and I remember that in the Sistine Chapel, you have, the angel expelling Adam and Eve from paradise, and there is Adam warding off the sword of the angel with this gesture. And so what we did was a very simple experiment, I don't have time to go into the TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation experiment, in which we stimulated the premotor cortex of the brain just sufficiently in order to raise the wrist. In other words, you put the coil on the top. The brain neurologist knows exactly how to stimulate the premotor cortex. When going into details why we're looking at the premotor cortex, we have to do it because that's movement preparation. We stimulated just so that it could raise the hand like this a little. And when they looked at so we have got the MEP, the motor lobe potential, of the current required to raise this hand. We looked at that, and then we made the person look at first, mixed up with my buttons here. First, with the a very good imitation of, you see Adam's hand raised on the right, and Fortunato, my colleague, did a very good imitation of that with his hand. And what we found was that when they looked at the painting of the expulsion from paradise by Michelangelo on the Sistine ceiling, the motor potential was even greater, and in fact, it stimulated a greater elevation of the hand. So that was all achieved just by looking at a picture. So, this I thought was pretty good in terms of giving an account of what happens in the brain when you have these feelings. And one is left with the aesthetic discussion, which we might have, which we're not going to have today, what Michelangelo did to make this arm gesture all the more effective. But we know some soft gestures are more effective than others. So, I want to look now more closely at the matter of embodied responses to the sight of the actions of others, because that's what we're talking about here, embodied responses to the actions of others. And image. I was always worried, for example, look at this. This is really an interesting image, I think. It's a picture of a man attacking it's a photograph of a man attacking the portrait of President Marcos just after President Marcos was deposed as president of the Philippines. And he's actually imitating the very gesture of Marcos himself. It's as if he's responding by imitation to the action of President Marcos, and this is a real clash here, and is about to destroy the picture. These are phenomena which you find over and over again, involving both imitation and reaction and violence. And I always take a picture like this. This is a detail of Rubens's Massacre of the Innocents, and what strikes you here is you look at that image, you have a sense of the raising of this child, you know exactly what he's going to do with this child and smash it to the ground, and look at the desperate hands of the woman on the right-hand side trying to ward off that poor child. At this point, the ward off, the throwing down, so you understand the throwing down action, you feel it in your muscles, but you also have a sense of this warding off gesture ourselves. All this can be tested. We can find the motor cortical responses to exactly the site of such actions. I became very interested at that point in mirror neurons. Some of you have read my writing now. I've been very interested in mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. Can we just have a show of hands? Does everybody here know? Who does not know about mirror neurons? Okay, so you all know about mirror neurons. That's good. I got very involved with the I got very involved with the team of scientists who had made the discovery of mirror neurons in the premotor cortex of the brain and in the lower parietal zone. And we did many experiments in which we were able to show exactly the activation of those parts of the brain that are responsible for the movement of figures that you saw, also in the brain of the beholder. The people in Parma initially did this with monkeys, obviously, and then when I was accused, along with them, of not only looking at monkeys, eventually you were able to establish the same responses in the human premotor cortex and the lower parietal zone of the brain as well. And this, it seemed to me to give a good account of why we might feel, why we do feel in our own bodies the actions of others. One of the most influential members of the Mirror team was Vittorio Gallesi, who introduced into the literature just at the time. There was much discussion of embodied images and embodied responses to images, the notion of embodied simulation. In other words, the notion that you simulate the actions of others, and emphasizing the actions, you simulate the actions of others within yourself, even if you do not actually execute those actions yourself. This seemed to me completely sufficient to account for those feelings which many of you will say, well, I didn't have such a reaction. Even if you say you don't have this kind of reaction, experiments with TMS and also by electroencephalography show exactly these reactions to the site of the actions of others. I also became interested at the time, I should have added, at how I recognized immediately the sight of images that inspire fear and therefore a desire to fight. And I chose to consider things like, see, the shock that one has at the snakes from the head of Medusa I've taken Caravaggio, and the open mouth always evokes an imitated response, and it evokes the sense of horror that you might imagine the Medusa head herself has, as well as beholders of this image. I'm just going to show you some others here. I just found in my slide collection. This is Copley, and this is Watson and the Shark, and a great painting from the middle of the 19th century, but I think one can all be struck not only by the gestures of the poor drowning person in the foreground, but by the teeth and open mouth of the shark cruising. And this is why the question of the Gombrickian question of making and matching is really critical. I'll show you in a moment that it's not always a matter of high naturalism. It's a matter of how we reconstitute as beholders the best living form of images that we see before us that suits our need to reconstitute the living form. Oops. Let's do it backwards. Oh, see, this is the great Medusa head by Rubens in Vienna. This is arouses disgust, and actually, so it's not only fear, you, as it were, mimic the fear, you have a sense of imitating the expression of that chocolate Medusa head, but you also, and that notion of fear does produce a kind of fear response, which involves the activation of the muscles of the leg, you want to run away, involves activation of the hands, close your eyes, and it also has a response in the insula, the anterior insula, which reacts in the case of feelings of disgust. We can talk about that. There may be a residue of you who think this all sounds too much like the 19th century science, but in fact, we have these clear indications of those responses, of responses in the motor cortex and the insula in the case of an image such as this, Rubens' Medusa head. In fact, the interesting thing about this picture is that one of the owners of Constantine Huygens, the 17th century Dutch statesman, used to keep it covered by a curtain in his house, and then when visitors came, like pulling away the curtains and waiting for the shock that the horror and disgust that it produced in his visitors. And we have actually the same story in the case of Michelangelo doing a similar thing with the shield for Lorenzo Olga, Francesco de' Medici. And we have also no difficulty in recognizing here and looking at those responses which, I became interested in those responses which I thought were, I hate to use the term, but just for the sake of moving along now, universal, that anyone, any human being on earth can tell that this is not someone who is happy. I used to have vigorous arguments with people who would say, well, you know, you talk about everybody can recognize a happy person, and they would say, well, in China they don't smile when they're happy. This is nonsense, as we all know. I mean, we really have to work on accepting the fact that people recognize these basic emotions and how they're expressed by the body. You also see that this is a man who is in high distress. You don't need to be a Christian to see that this is someone who is on the verge of death. You don't need to know about the crown of thorns. You don't need to know that it's Christ. But you certainly can see that this guy is going. It was Christ on the cross in blue paths. So now let's get back to movement. So here I show you an interesting it's not a tarot card, they are tarot cards, Prince of the Death of Orpheus, which we're going to come back to later on. But there again, I think, you know, I always felt that you had a sense, remember the man raising the hand, you have the same sense of the woman as the Maenad raising the sword about to blow at chop off or smite Orpheus there, defending himself up with the arm like that. And you have a clear sense of that, as you also do. These are 15th century prints of the actions of this battle of the sea gods. Now, here's something quite interesting. What we also did an experiment, this is a painting by Yusuf Fontana. His concetto spaziale, the concepts of space, he called it ironically. But what we found was that when you look at a painting by Fontana, and when you looked at a digital equivalent of that, without those slightly widening slices in the canvas, you had a greater suppression of gamma responses in the brain, which indicates a response to movement, the state of movement. And so we had this diminution of gamma responses here in the case of the Lucio Fontana, and we did this also because it was obviously something produced by a night action, and we showed also the activation of arm muscles and hand muscles that would have been produced in the case of, sorry, pointing to the image in front of me, the image behind me, they would have been produced in the course of making the slash. We found the same thing in these 12th century piece of calligraphy. Chinese are a very good thing to test for the EEG, electroencephalographic responses to this, indicating an awareness of a response to movement by the suppression of gamma waves, and then in the brain, and then here, what is quite interesting, by contemporary artists who made Chinese characters with the aid, you can just see in the background, of a torch, in which you can see here very clearly the relationship between the movement of the body, if you like, and the production of these things. So movement and action is everything, and it's related to the question of emotion. And so when we get onto emotion, we begin to recognize that the woman wiping her eyes in the background, you see her there, is sad. You begin to recognize that John the Evangelist, the figure in red on the left, is concerned. I'm going to show you, some of you who have read some of my writing know this is an example I've used very often. This is a man who is receiving, you can just see the water right corner, we'll come back to it in a moment, the Virgin collapsing in front of the cross. But you don't need to know any of this stuff, because you could see someone is engaging in a basic biological response to tears. You put your hand over a cloth to wipe them away. You can tell that John the Evangelist, that figure in front, is concerned by the wrinkles on his forehead. You can also understand the clasping of the hands, the tight clasping of the hands of the Magdalene, shall we say, on the right. Here, from modern times, this is a photograph again of a woman in Baghdad. I always thought that was a dead child. In front, it's just a child who was fainted, and they are in fact mourning the loss of a son to an American bomb. And we recognize this gesture of grief instantaneously. We open mouth and the gesture could not be clearer. But look at this, you go to Goya, one of the great exponents of desperation by a movement, and you see that right over there in this frontispiece to the Desastres de la Guerra. That's the introduction to his amazing series of illustrations of the Peninsular War at the beginning. And when Christ is put into the tomb, we can all understand that she is throwing up her hands in distress. And similarly, in Goya's May of 1818, the May of 1818, the man who is about to shot a very similar gesture of desperation. I've left out various aspects of mirror theory, but I think we can move on right away. What I want to emphasize is that these are immediate pre-conscious responses, precisely like running away from a horrible or dangerous sight, closing one's eyes, as they said, at first sight of something shocking, averting one's gaze, wiping a tear, holding one's hands across one's chest in shock, in emotional desperation, horror, or human tragedy. I mean, omitted one, but never mind. I think here I also want to point out that the mirror theorists also became interested in what happens when we see punctures in the flesh of others. And what they found was that when you see, this is Christ's hand in the painting by Roger van der Weyden, and it shows Christ's hand pierced by the nail and coming down from the cross, and then also the nails that went through his feet. You've got a better image here. You see these things and you immediately step back in shock. That's the arm of the Christ that we see in the Isenheim Runevold. I don't think anyone can doubt the effective feeling of the nails through the palm. And then the remarkable painting by Caravaggio, the incredulity of Thomas. This is where Christ, after the resurrection of the flesh, the story of the resurrection of the flesh, the incarnation of Christ, is absolutely fundamental to all image history. It occurs in one form or another. It's not necessarily Christian. This is the basic form of response to images and to symbols as well, the need to enflesh them, which resulted in the creation of doctrines such as this. So this is the response I was thinking of to the question by saying that this is so central an aspect of Christian doctrine, it wouldn't mean anything to viewers. Of course it means something to viewers. It doesn't have the doctrinal aspect and the religious quality, but we all get the effect of the painting right away. You not only have a sense of the finger being poked into Christ's side, which you can see behind me, excuse me, I'm looking, but you also have a sense of the way in which Christ is a mirror neurons firing away like nothing. You also have a sense of that hand, once I pointed out to you, and if you looked at it long enough, you would also, that is clasping the Apostle Thomas's hand and pulling it into his side. Now you may say this is all very necessary to know this aspect of the proof of the resurrection of the flesh. But what we're talking here is about mimesis, and we talk about mimesis, the effectiveness of these kinds of gestures in arousing immediate pre-conscious responses. And there's nothing to do with rivalry. These are immediate direct responses, which is a result of the mirroring of mimesis by human beings, mirroring of actions by human beings, the sight of the travails of others. These are pre-reflective and automatic responses. We can have a whole discussion that was raised yesterday about the relationship between automatic responses and, I'm not going to talk about desire and paintings, or at least so-called pornographic representations, iconoclasm, and desire. But these are things which have nothing to do with rivalry, but have to do with immediate neural responses, which can be located and tested in the brain. What I also wanted to say is that there may, of course, these immediate responses may, of course, later be modulated by top-down cognitive input from cultural contexts, and indeed differently so. But also is when you see something in a painting, when you're in a museum, shall we say, and you seem to begin imitating the action you see when you want to point it out to your friend in a museum. You see and you want to do this perhaps, or you want to know more what to point in the museum, or you want to demonstrate a gesture, you imitate it, and then you stop yourself because you suddenly realize you're in a museum, or because you realize you might damage the work. This is top-down intervention, and this kind of inhibition of an action is something that is also how many minutes do I have? Some minutes, let me see. I'm going to do a calculation of how many minutes I have. I've got a bit of time. These are all cortical processes which will be shown, proven in even time. There's nothing mysterious about them. So, of course, some responses are modulated by context, but what I'm interested in getting at are those responses which are pre-cultural modulation and are bottom-up responses that are basic and elemental. Let me see if I can move on swiftly now to come to, oops. There. Okay, so just to give you a sense of these basic responses that relates to everything we've been saying, here's a picture, very interesting, of while under restoration. This had been covered over. This is a detail of the 7 acts of charity, in which one of the people giving acts of charity, of course, is a fundamental aspect of Catholic, not Protestant doctrine. We'll talk about that later on if you wish. But the 7 acts of mercy, saying that here was giving food and so on to the poor. This is an attack on the eyes of a man giving charity to alms to a sick person. And this attack is both shocking and well aimed because it gives you a sense of the ways in which the living aspect of an individual are taken away from that individual by poking out the eyes. Poking out the eyes is a very common gesture we find amongst iconoclasts. Here's a good example of censorship in which the reformer Erasmus, who never left the Catholic Church, but was disapproved of by an amazing thing, his eyes being poked out and his mouth being sewn up. Attacks on eyes and mouths are the most common of all iconoclastic acts, and we find them, because they deprive their image life, we find them across cultures. Time and time again, this is the king of Bahrain, the Sultan of Bahrain. I just want to go through something very quickly, and then I'll conclude. Here is a gesture you've seen before, this raising of the instrument of execution. And you have a sense of the body, what's going on. The sense of the raising arm, that Saddam was saying before the statue came down. That's somebody. Look at this Goya, again from the Peninsular War, but the same sense of raising that gesture of raising an instrument here of destruction. We see it before, an instrument for destruction of buildings, here of human life. And also those gestures, for example, the hand of warding off, if you can see it in the background. Goya again. But I'm using this here because look here at, I want to introduce the name of someone who is not being for some reason or another. This is my only consolation of not having mentioned René Girard in my own work. When I discovered that René Girard, I don't know whether this is an utterance of pride or not, but it's just as I left out Girard, perhaps as punishment for his never mentioning A.B. Bargo. A.B. Bargo was a great cultural historian whose work actually on the neural substrate of actions, he was very aware of the importance of action in both making images and of what he called the pathos formula. The pathos formula was the recurrent gesture which he recognized from the beginnings of time across cultures. And here is the pathos formula, which we've seen. And he wrote it in an article about Dürer's death of Orpheus. I think I have a bigger thing. You see those very gestures and actions, which we've seen time and time again. And it's handed down through the ages. This gesture of warding off the blow we find on the Greek vase. There you go. And so on. Here is the Roger van der Weyden, which is full of these pathos formulae. Let me just show you here. So here's the whole picture. You can see what's so interesting is the Virgin collapses in exactly the same way as the body of Christ. Her action is mirroring that of Christ coming down from the cross. But what I think is interesting about this is that we too, in looking especially at the Virgin, have a sense within ourselves of the slumping of our own bodies. There we go. I'll show you some details. We've looked at these indeed are pathos formulae as well. We recognize the sadness. They occur across the ages. Here is Klaus Schluter, the Well of Moses in Dijon. Same thing, wiping of the eyes. Wonderful gesture. We imitate them and we know what's going on. And if we imitate them well, we indeed feel sadness ourselves. Here's the self-protective touching across the chest, which we've seen time and time again. This is the top part of Giotto's Lamentation, which has other parallels, and that's like a whole repertoire of the gestures of desperation, which, again, are over the body of Christ. But again, you don't need to know the story in order to understand any of these actions. Here's the Son of Christ. There's the slide of the Virgin. We see from her face that she is about to expire. And Roger van der Weyden, quite unknowingly, chose his Virgin, so as the Mother of Christ, not only collapsing bodily in the same way, but also showing the hands. Look at that exact hand. There's the symbol of the resurrection on the right and the hand on the left of the Virgin. It's imitation over and over again. But I wanted for Barbara, the great thing of the pathos forming was that it was an expression of melancholy. And here you can see Joseph putting his hand, Joseph putting his hand on the, I lost my. I think you can still hear me at the back. You can still hear me at the back. You can hear me? Okay. I think we have 2 minutes for this correction. Okay. So here are these can't move with this. Here are these wonderful gestures of melancholy. Can we abbassare il volume? And the wonderful gestures of sadness which we easily imitate, which easily contaminate our own feelings. And I feel that's the famous print of melancholy. And I just think that I'm going to stop here. I have a 3-minute commentary if you'll allow me, Blanca, but I'm going to leave this wonderful portrait, which also shows Dürer's own melancholy at his incapacity to understand the world, and I hope this doesn't reflect your own melancholy at the hearing of my talk. But I'm going to move now just to my conclusion. Get to the conclusion, which I think is quite important because I haven't got to the Oikoumene yet, and I want to do this right now. Move right to the conclusion. Okay, so what I want to say, these are emotions which every human being recognizes, even though often enough it may be provoked or stimulated by entirely different cultural contexts. When you look at Roger's altarpiece, you know, whatever your religion, the suffering both of Christ as a man and the co-suffering of the viewers, their compassio, their feelings, their sadness and their physical travails. I use this example precisely because we know so much about how people were supposed then to respond to the work. We're supposed to look at these pictures of the suffering Christ and feel that suffering yourselves. So we have meditational treatise after meditational treatise, Imitationes Christi Imitationes, which actually are predicated on the awareness that you look at something, you understand the gestures of distress, you see the sight of the wound, you feel it in your own body. this is also, of course, the exercitia spiritualia of Saint Ignatius Loyola, which is lies at the foundation of Jesuit beliefs. They use these cognitive, these neural processes as a basis for ensuring the effects of images without knowing anything about it. They transform them into useful scriptural proofs. So, the thing is that a great artist like Roger knows which pathos formula to use and how they are accessible to others. He knows this is not just a matter of rivalry, whether aesthetic or psychological, but one of sharing what is human across cultures, of reconciliation and common understanding. Mimesis is not only a product of rivalry that results in sacrifice and murder, perhaps even more importantly, it's via the mimetic process that we arrive and may arrive at mutual understanding and reconciliation across cultural borders. It's predicated on biological factors. I know that some of you will not like that, even the mention of the biological factors, but they are there, they are automatic and spontaneous, they come upon us prior to the cognitive overlays of culture that may lead to competition, rivalry, and dissent. It's certainly a vehicle that can be overlaid by top-down adjustment, as I've said, but that can be both negative and positive. It can reinforce antagonisms, but it can also generate the kinds of inhibition that is capable of constraining but restraining violence. That is the ecumenical role of Mimesis in our world that we should never forget. Girard himself knew this, and even if you think that he overemphasized the lessons of Catholic Christianity in the eschatology of the resurrection of the flesh, let us remind ourselves of his own acknowledgement that his hitching of violent sacrifice and scapegoating to the vehicle of Mimesis was intended as a warning to ethnocentrism and a recommendation of ecumenicity in the broadest of senses. We begin to think not so much about mimetic rivalry, but about how mimetic responses need not always have to do with rivalry or desire, but in fact the opposite. For me, they have to do with empathy and understanding. To examine these processes is to come closer to the basic ecumenical possibilities within all of us and within reach of us all. Difference does not mean that we are incapable either of mutual human understanding or even of the understanding of cultural artifacts like art. Mimetic desire need not lead to strife and sacrifice. It can lead to empathy and deep comprehension of the bodily travails, and through their bodily movements and the activation of mirror responses in the bodies of others, their emotional travails as well. Indeed, the fundamental possibility within all humans for automatic and immediate understanding lies precisely within the exchanges I've described. This is why I reject the purely anthropologico-philosophical basis of Girard's psychology of mimetic desire and rivalry. It remains incomplete, like so much anthropology, without an understanding of the biological bases of imitation, action, and empathy. Girard's work goes a long way to demonstrate the violence that underlies our social interactions and the role played by mimetic impulses within it. But it's only half the story. The other half of the story is in fact where he and I come together in Girard's own rejections of current forms of ethnocentrism, and above all the way in which a suspicion of ethnocentrism has cast such a baleful light upon our thinking about the future and possibilities of cross-cultural understanding. Now we tend to be negative about this possibility. We underestimate it because we think that the hopes ecumenicity involves as a product of ethnocentrism. We think that the very term ecumenism is entirely Christian. In fact, when I talk about it to my colleagues, they think I've become a Christian. I haven't. Oikoumene means the community of human beings in the world, and those are the people that we remain concerned with, and imitation provides us with access to mutual understanding across boundaries and across difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Freedberg, for this. And he's the author and editor of various books on mimetic theory, including René Girard, Violence and Mimesis and Mortal Conspiracy, The Importance of Being Paranoid, co-authored with Anna A.J. The floor is yours.
you. I've got quite a naturally loud voice. I probably don't need this, but I'm bad at small talk. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll just start. I'll be going for about 3 hours. No. Then, okay. On seeing photographs of the Bergen-Belsen and Dachau concentration camps, Susan Sontag remarked that nothing she'd seen in photographs or in real life ever cut her sharply, deeply, instantaneously. Indeed, it was realistic for her to divide her life in two, that life before, as it was before she saw them, aged 12, and after, though it was several years, she says, before she better understood what they were about. But it would be unrealistic to say, knowing her work as a whole, that Sontag was blind to the danger of images and their vexed relationship to human suffering. Such concerns, in fact, consume much of her attention in her famous work on photography. And yet, despite these dangers, I want to try to make sense of Sontag's shock and the claim with which that experience was tied. Part of the risk attendant upon doing so will, I hope, be minimised by my shifting emphasis from a discussion of the image to images, to begin with specific cases and see what they might help elucidate. I do this not only because overly general accounts of the image, I think, tend towards a kind of vacuity, but that a focus on the concrete and even the personal is central to my concerns. In 1990, in Australia, a private members' bill was proposed which would reduce the minimum date of termination of pregnancy from 24 to 21 weeks. Soon after it was announced that the legislation would be voted upon, politicians began to receive from an anonymous source an image of a fetus at 21 weeks, pictured sucking its thumb, something like this. It was later revealed that the image was not of a live fetus at all, but from a medical lab and sent in as a joke by some student wag with a dreadful sense of humour. By then, however, the reaction against the photo had set in. Critics called uses of such images upsetting, manipulative, bullying, hectoring, and of course, emotive. Such reactions are common. In her essay, The Emotional Imperative of the Visual, Kirsty McLaren makes a parallel point. Images of the fetus try to evoke emotion and cast that emotion as evidence of the significance of the fetus. The viewer's presumed reaction to seeing the fetus establishes the fetus as a subject. The reaction is construed by pro-life campaigners as a natural and irrefutable indicator of the moral connection between our society and the fetus. The philosophical conceptualisation of personhood, in which capacity and autonomy are usually necessary, is not relevant in this moral landscape. The fetus places a moral duty on pro-life activists because of its incapacity. In Fetal Rights, and another essay, S.C. Cornell puts the matter this way: the strongest argument against abortion is not an argument at all. It's the image of the fetus. Tiny feet, perky nose, pre-melanin skin, and of its often grisly death. The persuasive potential has been clear for over a century. Cornell is saying, in other words, that although such images may have impact, they are properly outside the realm of reason. The opposition that McLaren works from here is a standard one: emotional response versus reasonable discussion. I don't think, however, that such an opposition is coherent, and it may also be beside the point. For one thing, it would be unusual to suggest that those who favour using such images do so because they are emotional, as if this were a good in itself. And even if some do say this, surely a better reason exists for those who support their use, that the distribution of such images to politicians may force them to confront the fact that if killing something like what is pictured is what they were killing, then they may not be able to support such a bill. or at least not supported for the reasons the law sanctions. I want to be clear here, I am not stating a position on abortion in this talk, and nor am I suggesting that anyone who sees such an image will be pro-life, which is clearly absurd. Rather, I'm trying to assess the role of such images in the discourse by which they are surrounded and the philosophical significance of such talk. The first point to be made is that opposition to their use is not to be found on the sorts of oppositions McLaren and Cornell, conceptual oppositions, that McLaren and Cornell predicate their claims. To begin to see this, I want you to imagine a scenario in which a certain kind of mimetic operation causes a change in someone. I want to then ask what that change would amount to and how the person so changed, and we might want to speak of it. And I say mimetic operation because I also want to put in parentheses for a moment even ideas of desire. Imagine two close friends, Rosa and Lena. Rosa falls pregnant and Lena is moved by her friend's love for her unborn child, by what love might mean in such a case. 1 year later, Lena falls pregnant. But far from being excited, she resents the pregnancy, regrets it, its inconvenience, the lack of planning, the seeming unsuitability of the father, the bad timing, and so on. She thinks of getting an abortion, but demurs, recalling her friend Rosa's love, coming to the realisation, and a painful one at that, of her already having been changed by that love. Lena arrives and finds herself in the position where she thinks it impossible for herself, personally, to get a termination. If asked about this, she might say she couldn't do it, quote, because I've come to see what I'd be doing were I to have an abortion, or because I've come to feel differently about my having an abortion. A certain kind of philosopher, perhaps Cornell or McLaren, may assess these statements and say that the second one is the correct one. Because the second is clearer about the fact they would say that this change is an emotional one. But this would mistake the matter. For a start, regarding emotions, we may ask, which emotion? As I said, Lena finds it unpleasant to be pregnant, inconvenient, and she resents it. But she also wishes she were not resentful, because she takes a view of her resentment as if that resentment were an attitude towards her child, as though that child were born. And this view has been elicited in her, we might say, intersubjectively, mimetically, by another, by the love she recalls seeing in her friend. There's an issue here about mimesis as a moral phenomenon, which I'll take up later. For now, it is enough to say that to find out what Lena thinks of this change, we'd need to see how she speaks of it. It's hard to see how she conceives of this moral impossibility and termination by any reference to a reticence about killing a fetus. Note the implausibility of the grammatical construction, my fetus, or even more implausibly about God's fetus. And this is why her shift should be characterised by the locution, I came to see what I'd be doing, rather than I came to take a different attitude to what I'd be doing. But importantly, this entails that it would also be wrong, as pro-life advocates often do, to put her shift in terms of a claim like, I came to realise what kind of thing I would be causing the death of. For that suggests a morally neutral redescription of the fetus independent of her relation to it. Like she would see things the same way were this fetus not in her belly, but being gestated, for instance, in a cabinet on some space station. To be clear, the perspective being defended here isn't that it makes no sense to say that moral conclusions follow from the facts. Rather, it's that the facts, as we take them to be, condition what our sense of what moral conclusions we may draw. To see this, I'll use another example. Let's say we witness a frail elderly man in distress being beaten up by 3 thugs, and so we run towards the scene. What were the facts here upon which we concluded to make an intervention? In the first instance, phenomenologically speaking, there doesn't seem to be anything like the appearance of of facts about which we reached a conclusion. We simply ran. In any case, the facts here are inseparable from what one sees and describes of a frail man being beaten up by thugs. To choose to describe it otherwise, say a pathetic weak fighting three real men, figures the scene differently. Even an ostensibly clinical description, like a mature male human being physically assaulted by three young male humans, carries with it a certain sort of distance, which is itself morally conditioned, and in certain circumstances we would even see such a description as repugnant. That doesn't mean people might not describe the scene in that way, just that it makes no sense here to talk of empirical facts about which moral conclusions will be drawn. And we should also note the moral stridency present in those who are upset by the use of ultrasound images with which I began my talk, and that many of those who reacted so strongly against such images would, under different circumstances, have no hesitation in using images with those they thought of as only having the most abstract understanding of what it means to, say, drop bombs on civilians, of starvation, or of what dying of AIDS looks like. What would we make of the claim that these are emotional, or as some prefer, emotive, not abstract and universal, containing philosophical discussions or personhood? And what would we make of the idea that such images are therefore irrelevant to the task of ethics? And could the same be said of the following? This is one of the most famous images associated with the transatlantic slave trade, published in 1788. It aimed to show how tightly packed slaves were, in some cases with less than 3 feet of headroom. Or images, for instance, of Wilson Chin and Peter, differently named sometimes, both from 1863, circulated in the mid-19th century in Harper's Magazine and becoming central to the abolitionist cause. What would we make of someone who said of these photographs that they were emotive and that as an argument they are null and void? Or, to paraphrase S.C. Cornell, the strongest argument against slavery is not an argument at all. It's the image of the enslaved, beaten, scarred and branded. Here the words take on a new meaning for us and sound suspect. At the risk of labouring a disavowal, I am not saying that one day abortion is difficult to talk about, especially in American. I realise how heated it is. I'm using it as a visual example. I'm not saying one day that abortion will or should be seen in the same way, or that it should be. This isn't about moral equivalence, but about what we see fit as material for ethical reflection and the sorts of inconsistencies in our ideas of what is acceptable. But were someone to say this, that they are emotive, one response might begin with agreement. But then the question would be why they so move us. Why do these photographs still retain their force? And a possible answer to that may be that they allow us to have an imaginative and concrete understanding of slavery, where before one might have had an overly abstract notion of what was meant by the term. My father used to say that the fastest route to becoming a vegetarian would be to visit an abattoir. His point wasn't that suddenly emotion would suddenly here trump reason. There is no doubt emotion would be involved, but part of that is internal to a sense of a response to the prompt, you want to know where your burger comes from? In situations like this, an honorific like reason, especially when opposed to emotion, will mislead us. To use an example from literature, here is King Lear looking over his kingdom and realising his neglect of the poor. Poor actually doesn't do well reading Shakespeare with an Australian accent. I need to be like Gilbert or those poor naked wretches. Well, sir, when you are that bind the pilgrim. No. This pitiless storm, how shall... That was quite with Gilbert, actually, wasn't it? Anyway, I'll stop. How shall your house in unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from such seasons as these. Oh, and take too little care of this. Take physical, meaning take your own medicine. Expose thyself to feel what wretches did. How are we to understand this? Was it Lear's emotions which modified his reason, or his reason which modified his emotions? Either option here misconceives what's going on. Here it would be better to perhaps abandon emotion versus reason and simply speak of thinking well or thinking poorly, of lucidity versus error. This is not to say that our feelings may not be gotten on the cheek, or that they're infallible windows through which the real can be seen. We might, for instance, be overcome by sentimentality or bathos. But here I want to say that it's not simply our feelings that have led our reason astray, but contrarily that sentimentality, for instance, isn't merely a way of throwing reason off, but one of the forms of falseness itself. It is surely not the philosopher's task to denounce things, such as, say, sadness, but to be able to discern cheap versus serious forms of them. Will Girardian anthropology help us get further here, in a better, more complete sense of moral obligation? I think so, but only if it is understood in a particular way. In his article, Naturalising Ethics, Paul Dumichel, I was speaking to Paul last week, and I sent him this morning, so I'm not talking about it. Paul Dumichel argues that Girard appears to suggest that what we call morality is in fact, in part, derived from distinctions which rest on more or less lucidly perceived differences between those actions that lead to sacrificial crises and those that either constitute obstacles to its reenactment or put an end to collective violence. Although Dumichel's paper is, by his own admission, exploratory, I don't think ethics can be naturalised, or certainly not in this way. If we read Nietzsche's famous passage in The Will to Power about the decadence of the doctrine of the equality of all souls before God, of the human as only enduring through sacrifice, then what will strike us about Girard's reading of this text will be that Girard sees in Nietzsche an astonishing corroboration of his anthropology. Famously, that between Dionysus and Jesus, it is, quote, not a difference in regard to their martyrdom, it is a difference in the meaning of it. But what is the meaning of meaning here? At one level, we could say the difference is the revelatory meaning of Christian history. At another, we could frame this meaning as a moral meaning, that where Nietzsche proclaims to praise what he sees in the Dionysian, Girard glosses Nietzsche's view by saying, and here I quote Girard, a culture has to pay a price in order to breed a class of high men. It has to assume even the worst forms of violence. Girard is here saying, in effect, that where others sugarcoated the Dionysian, Nietzsche saw this violence and endorsed it. What could we call this but a moral depravity? And Girard obviously sees it as such. Then again, Girard's work is not supposed to be normative in any sense. He takes the path of the theorist who describes in scientific terms, anthropological terms, rational terms, the development of culture and religion. But I'd suggest there is no way around the moral when describing the anthropological, and not merely in a supplementary way. This is perhaps hidden because Girard is operating at the level of textual exegesis and anthropology, and after all, it would simply be grandiose for him to say, after all, and by the way, sacrificial killing of the sort Nietzsche wants, is like pretty evil. Any argument justifying that conclusion would be, to us, less obvious than the argument itself. In any case, the judgment is inseparable from the observation in Girard. In such context, it would be unnecessary for Girard to say, and just as a side note, we should exercise compassion for the victim, because he relies on a sense of the human that is already ethically conditioned. After all, what else could the term victim mean? The question is whether Girard is revealing an anthropological point or an ethical one. Surely it is both, or rather, this distinction no longer makes sense. To talk of a victim is simultaneously revelatory in the anthropological sense and inherently normative. Yet to think moral talk, as suggested by Michel, can grow simply out of anthropological or sociological talk of taboos, interdictions, or even social contracts won't work. If you attempted to think so, imagine someone, after having accidentally run someone over on a freeway, saying, "Oh my God, what have I done? I have broken the taboo against killing." Or, "Oh my God, what have I done? I have violated the interdiction on interest-specific homicide." What we mean by moral aren't applications of ideas like interdiction or taboo, but rather standing moral judgment of them. Girard's work itself does this, even if it never proclaims itself to be doing so. But in saying we're here talking of a moral attitude towards the person as victim, what room does mimetic theory even have for the person? We used in mimetic theory to speak of the interindividual relation, the idea that we are not individuals but interindividuals. And this way of putting matters well captures the fact that human beings are constituted first and foremost in their relations to others. But in our moral relations, the concrete individual is precisely what is at stake. The descriptive truth of intersubjectivity, the constitution of the human person through his or her shared life in language and in communities of practice, should not block from view the normative claim that our sense of others is ethically conditioned. The individual may not exist, but people still do. To see this, consider how remorse functions with us. Imagine tonight walking back to your hotel and being confronted by a beggar who is assertive, aggressive, and insistent. He demands money but will not move. You push him back and he stumbles and falls onto the road where he is hit by a passing car and killed. Many of you I don't know personally about your meta-ethical stances, yet here I feel I can read your mind. You will likely be gripped by remorse, haunted by this event for a long time to come. There are 2 points to be made here. What I am calling remorse isn't a mere emotion, yet an emotional response is internal to the recognition of what one has done. Indeed, we might say in despair, "Oh God, what have I done? Oh Dieu, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait?" Again, by remorse, I'm not primarily describing an emotional reaction. It isn't the emotion here that provides remorse with its sense or legitimacy. Rather, I'm describing the meaning of what one has done. It makes no sense to speak of remorse without its emotional component. You can't really imagine someone going to deep remorse and yet feeling nothing. And just as a reaction will not import anthropological categories, nor will it draw its sense from the major traditions in normative ethics, virtue ethics, deontology, or utilitarianism. For those of you who thought I might be loyal to the mainstream in philosophical ethics, here at least I'm not. Again, try these options out. My God, what have I done? I've destroyed the life of a rational being with self-determination. Or, my God, what have I done? I've acted recklessly and violated the social contract. What have I done? I've undermined my chances for flourishing. What have I done? I have contradicted my own free chosen principles. And further to say we would be haunted by killing this person, it's necessary to point out that we will not be haunted by a principle. We will not be haunted by a duty. We will be haunted by a person, the person whose life we took. The person in their concrete reality confronts us, and of course the concrete personal can be confronted. To see this, consider the creedal claim: he was crucified, died, and was buried. Now look at Hans holding the youngest, the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. What the painting here pictures is not a Christ-type person, but a concrete being. Here Christ's death is rendered concrete in image in an incomparable way, and part of that is tied to the visibility of the victim, the realism, which Stuart and Schwager and many others, see as properties and biblical descriptions of violence. This is neither a depiction of a mythological figure, nor is it something that would provoke us to say in a cartoon medium, here lies a sentient being. It is rather the death of a person. It calls to us personally, as it famously did to Dostoevsky, whose wife was worried that he'd be fined because he kept trying to get closer to it. Who was, obsessed with this pain. But surely, I'll just go into the detail. But surely one objection to what I'm saying here is that it veers towards a kind of individualism and a subjectivism. To counter this, we need to be able to see the universality of the claim as to what we owe others, at the same time seeing the particularity of the victim, in light of which a moral response must be understood. An analogy might be used. Were one to grieve the death of a child, it is not merely a child has died, or even one of my children, let alone a rational being who is grieved, but that child who has died. Of course, the grief would be the same regardless of the child loss, but it is irreducibly focused on the child that has died. We love people, we feel remorse, and we grieve them in their particularity. Someone swept up in scapegoating, a person who later sees what they have done and feels remorse, is as it is because they have wronged a human being. But in order for the scapegoater to understand the moral gravity of what they have done, the victim must be present to them in their concrete individuality, because it is precisely in that form that makes sense of something like remorse. When one kills a human being, it is of course true that the victim might have been someone else, and yet the moral response would be the same. But again, in remorse, one is not haunted by every man. I'm claiming more than simply that in killing a human being, one is therefore haunted by a particular one. I am not describing a psychological particular tied to a general moral principle, for such would imply that such a haunting is extraneous to our moral response, that what is really at issue is the death of a representative of Homo sapiens. But individuality isn't reducible to individuating features. If we were to accidentally kill our own child instead of a stranger, there's a lot of killing going on in this paper, I realise that. Instead of a stranger, the nature of our remorse would be the same, even if the dimensions of the suffering were to differ. Part of the idea here is that for someone to be seen as a human being is to be seen as someone particular, as someone's child, as someone who can be broken by misfortune, as a possible recipient of someone's love. We see that the tramp we killed is someone's friend to the extent that it is intelligible that he rise to friendship's demands, even if he doesn't have any friends. This is part of our sense of someone being one of us, meaning sharing a common humanity. Our remorse is focused, concrete and particular because humans to us are this. Numbering our children or numbering our friends rather than naming them wouldn't be treating children or friends differently. It would give a completely different sense to the concept friend or child. Similarly, eating our pets, some philosophers might say, would be morally wrong, but it's probably more accurate to say that those who ate their pets wouldn't have pets in the same sense of the term, which we usually employ that term. Put in mimetic terms, it seems obvious that we can see the value of others. Our sense of their value can be sharpened when we see them in the light of another's love. Or that contrarily, prisoners can be made morally invisible to their guards when denied visits from loved ones. But even in the absence of such love, we may see people in the light of somebody's love, that they might be the object of somebody's love, even if that someone needs to be a saint, a projection. And I want to say here that seeing this, what is revealed is not the love of another, but what that love discloses. Not the virtue of the saint, but what virtue reveals, the preciousness of each human being. Girardians have spent considerable time talking about positive mimesis, and it's understandable, but I think it can be misleading. In Aschenberg Concepts, Girard says, up to a certain point, we might be in a state of positive undifferentiation, in other words, identified with others. This is Christian love and exists in our world. And differentiation is difficult to render in English, or it's too easy in some ways. In English, positive mimesis sounds a bit like Norman Vincent Peale or Dale Carnegie, as a Girardian. Positive often means constructive, optimistic, helpful, good role models. But the French positive has a range of associations not present in English, among them real, concrete, and undeniable. To draw out one possible sense that such a figuration might have, consider the following passage from A Common Humanity by the Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita. He is describing working in a mental health hospital as a student with the chronically, hopelessly mentally ill. Quote, one day, he's an atheist by the way, one day a nun came into the ward. In her middle years, only her vivacity made an impression on me until she talked to the patients. Then everything in her demeanour towards them, the way she spoke to them, the facial expressions, the inflections of her body, contrasted with and showed up the behaviour of a noble psychiatrist. She showed that they were, despite their best efforts, condescending, as I too had been. She thereby revealed that even such patients were, as a psychiatrist and I had sincerely and generously professed, the equals of those who wanted to help them. But she also revealed that in our hearts we did not believe this. A Girardian might say that seeing such a nun may prompt us to care in similar ways for the afflicted, and it may well do, or hope that it does. In this sense, she's an example of positive mimesis, in that sense of functioning as some kind of non-rivalrous role model. But what it also points to here is the way that somebody's behaviour may be revelatory for us. Not just the person giving such care, but those cared for. Note that Gaita is not saying that were he or any of the doctors working at the hospital asked if they thought the patients were their equals, that they'd deny it. Indeed, they would have affirmed such an idea wholeheartedly or endorsed it conceptually. But Gaita says that what the nun's behaviour showed him first was that such patients really were his and the doctor's equals, and second, that he and the doctors didn't really believe that. But what Gaita is suggesting here is that nun's behaviour reveals something about the objects of this nun's love, the patients themselves. Her behaviour revealed to Gaita that such people were, in fact, our equals. Admittedly, the scene here does reveal something mysterious, and there are forms of thinking that allow conceptual room for mysteries of this sort, others which do not, and most which don't even perceive the need for doing so. But we are invited to entertain the idea that the contours of the nun's demeanour fitted the shape of the reality which it disclosed. Here we are not simply talking about, say, the virtue of love as an excellence, or the good that may have come from the nun's behaviour, or even that she set a good example, or for its capacity to make clear the sacredness, or in the terms of Wolfgang Papa's reading of Simone Weil, the holiness, or as Gaita prefers, the full humanity of those afflicted who have been made invisible to others. In a biography of his father, Gaita described his growing up in central Victoria in the 1950s. Romulus Gaita, his father, had fled the former Yugoslavia with his German wife and arrived as refugees. His father had befriended a man named Vacek at an immigrant workers' camp. After the compulsory 2 years working, Vacek went mad and went to live 15 kilometres away from the Gaita's shadow. Visibly insane, Vacek talked to himself, did off-putting things like eating food with his own urine. After the autobiography came out, a journalist asked Gaita whether Vacek had seemed strange to him as a child. Gaita said no, but then wondered why. Quote, objectively, after all, he was very strange, and the answer came to me that was my father and Laura, as a friend of the family, behaved towards Vacek without condescension. And had they condescended to him, had it shown their tone, voice or demeanour, in their body language, as we often say, the cruel sensitivity that children often possess, would have made me conclude that Vacek was not entirely one of us. As it was, the contrary was true. Their treatment of Vacek enabled me to see him, his strange behaviour notwithstanding, as living yet just another form of human life. And that wasn't because I was particularly virtuous, it was simply because I saw him in the light of the behaviour towards him shown by my father and by his friend Laura. It is worth reflecting at what is at stake here and the kind of mimesis involved. It would be difficult to describe this as mimetic desire, even a desire for another's well-being or a desire for the good, although it may intersect with those. It speaks of something more primary, a fundamental orientation to others as seen in the light of another's sight. And there's so many examples we give, very banal medical examples. It recalls to mind, although Gator doesn't mention this, the nun. Surely part of what is being talked about here is that the other is subject to a particularly revelatory form of attention, that which possibly reveals what it tends to. Last section. Simone Weil spoke often about attention and its importance to ethics. Iris Murdoch went so far as to say, for Weil, morality was a matter of attention, not will. And thus Weil's work should prompt us, she says, to develop a new vocabulary of attention. In other words, ethics at a deep level is inseparable from a kind of attention or witnessing. Correlatively, the Welsh philosopher R.F. Holland says that a stance has to be taken, quote, and as it goes by default towards the difference between judgments which are of the highest significance for ethics and judgments that are not. In the former case, I'd say it's more a matter of registering an experience or marking an encounter in passing judgment, end quote. It may make philosophers uncomfortable to talk of ethics in terms of registering an experience or marking an encounter, as there's something irreducibly personal here. But Girard himself acknowledged something akin to this when he said that, quote, mimetic theory demands an existential understanding of what he grasped. But here more needs to be said about this personal response. Here I'm not talking about the personal assessment of some anthropological thesis, but the irreducibly personal element involved in moral response. The reason we don't see this or assume that when someone says something like this, we see the spectrum of subjectivism or relativism, is because we possess a distorted view of practical reason. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel, for instance, argues repeatedly against personal response. Quote, once we admit the existence of some other regarding reasons, I shouldn't read the quote in a silly voice, because it makes it, but kind of makes the evidence weak, doesn't it? Once we admit the existence of some form of other regarding reasons in a general application, we have to look for a way of specifying their content and principles of combination. That is not a first-person enterprise, end quote. To put this in context, Nagel saw himself as defending the kind of moral objectivism against its culture despisers, the relativists, Wittgensteinians, existentialists, and other miscellaneous continental deplorables, who would make morality some deeply personal thing. He contrasted his so-called rationalist account with what he called a subjectivist account, which he also called a merely personal account. In his many discussions of ethics, he sees his main challenge coming from the idea that there are no impersonal standards in ethics. There is much in Nagel's account that one could praise, but there is a baffling misunderstanding in his work about the nature of practical reason, especially of reason directed towards questions such as, what should I do? His attempts to distance all forms of practical reason from what is personal ends up producing a kind of distortion that produces absurdities. To see one of these contrasts two kinds of practical reason, both where one is trying to arrive at an answer free from psychological distortions, prejudice, and so on. Imagine that you have hired an accountant to come to an assessment of whether you should state your taxable income as $80,000 or $110,000. You could have done the tax yourself, given your familiarity with tax law and Excel, but have outsourced it to an accountant because you were busy. One form of practical reason. The accountant comes back and says, well, actually it's $230,000, although you couldn't get away with lying about it. But you were still busy. So you email a moral philosopher to solve the problem because you'll be skiing this weekend. You have a red card and won't have time for ethical reflection. You say to the philosopher, I need to decide whether it's okay to lie and I need the answer by 8 a.m. Monday to submit by 9. Nagel falsely believes practical reason is indifferent to what practical ends are being entertained, as if the question of how best to resuscitate a person to save their life is of the same sort as whether you should bother to resuscitate them at all. Yet if true, why does it strike us as normal to outsource our bookkeeping, but completely insane or either comical sinister to outsource our moral decision. And that is surely because the moral response, in a way different to other forms of practical reason in this restricted sense, is irreducibly personal. But in saying this, I don't want to be misunderstood. By personal, I'm not saying infallible, and I'm not imagining Descartes in his oven or a Husserlian reconstruction of morality and tax evasion based on a transcendental reflection on the structures of the fiscal eye. Our views are informed, are always informed, enriched or degraded by our common life, by our literature, by poetry, our friends, by the forms of speech we engage in, by reading Kant. Each of these is irreducible as it is essential. Although it may seem that Girard simply draws cognitive points from literature or religious texts, this cannot be the end of the story. Girard does not say that we can and must move beyond these texts and put them into scientific form. Even Girardians don't read the Bible to help them understand Girard. It's still the other way around. Against proponents of the Nouvelle Roman, Girard rightly saw that literature is connected to human life. The arts are the means by which we are taught things and not just merely happen to be how we are taught things. It would be strange to see a play about war and tell a friend about it, only for the friend to say, "Ah yes, that's true, I watched the news last night which confirms what you saw in the play." At their best, literature, painting, photography, and so on don't tell us things we could find out by other means. We react to these in various ways because of what is important to us and what we value and do, partly because they contribute to our sense of what matters most. And the arts are limited in ways we also need to countenance, that they won't reliably give us body counts or show numerical data which might fill in a complex picture. But they, like denounce behaviour, have the potential to reveal what they attend to. But having truck with images like reality itself is serious business, and realities located therein are easily named. To affirm, as some do, that we are all children of God is obviously an image, and by this I don't mean false. Yet that doesn't mean there aren't ways of distorting such statements. It would be inadvisable, for instance, to think we are children of God in the sense that we share 23 of our 46 chromosomes with Him. Rather, it is to inscribe God talk into the language of love. The truth of such talk can only be made sense of in such a language. If you're suspicious of my point here, you'll find it quickly confirmed if we try haphazardly to use synonyms for children, and by so doing produce bad poetry, bad philosophy, bad science, and bad theology all at once. We are the offspring of God. We are the juveniles of God. We are the minors of God. We are the ankle biters of God. We notice such offences against sense when a student unthinkingly uses a thesaurus to paraphrase something they don't understand, and we want to agree with the character in Tom Robbins' novel, Jitterbug Perfume, who shouts, "There are no such thing as synonyms." Of course there are, but synonyms have long blades, serrated edges, and small handles. Unless we see this, we may end up with a creed that begins, "We assert that there's one deity, the daddy invincible, manufacturer of utopia in the globe." Sontag was right to see both the potential power of the image as well as its dangers. Images no doubt do present dangers to us, but we in turn are a danger to them. One way of taking the measure of the decline of culture and its moral imagination is by witnessing the impoverished images in which it trades, the unthinking ways in which its citizens talk, by what that culture thinks it important to sing about, what it paints and how it worships, about what it feels important to affirm or deny, and how it does so. Languages die either when people no longer speak them, or when they fail to speak to people. And we should think very seriously about this. For human beings live not only in nature, but in those symbolic worlds which, after having been made, show their gratitude by returning the favour and making us in their